Well, thank you so much, Steve and Gabrielle, and obviously Josh and everyone else who showed up for this today. I'm always very excited when we have some ecological economics event, and listening to Josh speak is always great. So, without further ado, Dr. Joshua Farley, right, is my advisor. For full disclosure here. He's one of the biggest inspirations and reasons why I ended up doing a PhD in ecological economics. I'm still trying to finish it, but I'm very close to it. For full disclosure here, but he's a professor of community development and applied economics at the University of Vermont and faculty fellow at the Gunn Institute. Josh Farley, as he likes to be known, received his PhD from Cornell University in mainstream economics back in the 1990s and was inspired by the great late Herman Daly to become an ecological economist after realizing that mainstream economics fails to recognize the social and biophysical foundations required to manage humans' impacts and achieve well-being for all on our finite planet. Farley went on to co-author on, one of the most used introductory textbooks in ecological economics with Herman Daly, titled Ecological Economics Principles and Applications. Josh has published a myriad of articles on ecological economics and interdisciplinary socio-ecological problems. Most recently, Josh co-edited a couple of special issues on the next 30 years of ecological economics in the Journal of Ecological Economics and Sustainability. He also co-edited a research agenda book on sustainable well-being futures with Constanza Eriksson and Kubisiu. I can't pronounce her name. It goes into, yeah. Sorry about that. Recently, Farley served as the president of the International Society for Ecological Economics. Josh has been leading the Ecological Economics Strategic Network of the Leadership for the Ezoic project between the University of Vermont and McGill University. In Canada and the United States, where he advises a growing and diverse group of PhD students in ecological economics. The Leadership for the Ezoic trains future leaders to research, envision, and implement post-growth well-being futures that promote mutually enhancing relationships between humans and the rest of nature. So without further ado, I'll welcome Josh to take it away.
All right, thanks a lot, Rigo. So I'd say I have this tendency to try to cram too much information in. I wrote a couple editorials on ecological economics the next 30 years, but I wanted to integrate a lot more here on monetary policies and monetary systems, and also to talk a lot about, I think, often in ecological economics, we talk about the biophysical basis, but here I'm going to actually dwell a lot on the moral and the need for stronger moral and ethical foundations, but grounding those in science. So quickly, I'm going to just cover basics of ecological economics that a lot of people know. I saw some excellent ecological economists there. I'll just shout out to Phil Long, because I haven't seen him in a long time. Tons of other people I really like and know. So, but then I'll talk about the need for a better ecological macroeconomics, and the role of money, both modern monetary theory and the role of bank money. And then I'm going to really focus on the need for a sustainability ethics. So really moral and ethical foundations, but I want to ground this in evolutionary theory. Too often, scientists say, well, we're all about studying what is, and moral and ethics are about what ought to be. That's outside the field of science. I think that's ridiculous. I think, that the ethical and moral values evolved and continue to evolve, and we need to intentionally seek to evolve them in the directions necessary to address the challenges we face. So that's a super rough synopsis. The overall, obviously, this is super repetitive to anybody who knows studied ecological economics, but I want to talk about, the ecological economics paradigm focusing on the biophysical system. And we really see, the market is one part of the economy. The economy is one part of society. Society is embedded in a finite planet that is non-growing. The economy is a biophysical system that requires energy and raw materials to create anything, and in the process generates waste, which means that we have to be very conscious about the size of the economy relative to the ecosystem that sustains it. And over the past 100 years, the human population has quadrupled in size, and per capita consumption's increased about 9-fold, meaning the economy is 36 times bigger than it was 100 years ago. And this figure just shows the green being, the natural system, the brown being the human system, which everybody knows you can't make something from nothing. So everything the economic system produces requires matter and energy. Energy can't be recycled. Some matter can be. The goal of the economy is to generate economic services. But when the economy expands 36-fold, it doesn't expand into a void. It expands into our finite planet. And it displaces vital life support functions of our ecosystems we and all other species depend on for our survival. So a lot of the laws of economics and theories of economics emerged 200 years ago, 100 years ago in a wildly different system. So I'm not saying that economists back then were idiots. I am saying that the system has evolved. Economies are evolutionary systems. We must adapt to that. And I also want to talk a little bit about, there's the biophysical paradigm. There's also the behavioral paradigm. And mainstream economists say that humans are, insatiable. They always act in their own rational self-interest. And so I want to just ask something here in the chat. I want people to list behaviors or attributes of humans they would say are attributes of a good person or an evil person. So just please throw into the chat, say good and then give an attribute, and evil and give an attribute. And if you could do this quickly, I don't know if we'll see if it works. Yep. So people are saying like a good person is loving. A good person shows empathy, compassion, honesty. All excellent examples. They tell the truth. Good person is altruistic. Somebody says this thinking is too binary, but I'm going to get to, don't worry about that now. Bad is hateful, cruelty. Good is curious, evil is murder. Bad is enjoying the misfortunes of others. Good is caring. So this is actually enough for me to get the main point across that I want to say, that a good person in general puts the interests of the group ahead of the interests of the individual. A bad person puts the interests of the individual ahead of the interests of the group. And this is actually a very robust finding. I've done this in cross cultures and age groups and everything. The only time it didn't work this well was when I presented to a group of economists, and the first hand went up and said a good person is selfish. So now we take a look at this, and so we have good people and evil people, and let's put a good person and an evil person on a desert island. Who's going to do better? So the good person is going to share and help the other. The evil person is going to put their own interests ahead. So pretty clearly, the evil person contributes nothing to the welfare of the good person. The good person contributes to the welfare of the evil person. The evil person is going to do better. And this is what mainstream economists and mainstream evolutionists have long said, is that a good person, altruistic, cooperative person. Altruism, by definition, is somebody who sacrifices their fitness for somebody who is not related to them, and they're going to be less fit. They're not going to survive. So that's been the view of mainstream economics. Now let's take a look, though, at let's take a group. Sorry, I phrased this a little bit wrong. Let's put a group of good people on one island, a group of evil people on another island. Now which island is going to do better? And, the good people are going to cooperate. They're going to be able to solve these complex problems, maybe build irrigation systems, maybe go out and hunt large animals, whales or whatever. Where the evil people acting in their own self-interest, there's much less they can do. They're individuals rather than a collective group. One thing, though, that happens, what if you have these groups of islands with swimmers? So now the idea is that the bad person, there's a group of good people. If a bad person swims from the island to bad people to the island to good people, that person's going to get a lot of help from others, contribute nothing to them. And then the mainstream theory says, oh, that person's going to have an adaptive advantage, and their genes are going to outcompete the genes of the others. And we are going to end up with evil people always in dominating. And this is the mainstream theory, which I will contest dramatically. One thing, though, is one thing about good people people put a good person puts the group ahead of the interests of the individual. But if you're not part of the group, then we say nothing. So we have people who are so Adolf Hitler, for example, we considered if you look at propaganda from World War II, we talked about annihilating the Huns, tried to make them subhuman. Our good people would go there and do unspeakably evil things to the Nazis, and the Nazis, of course, to themselves were good people and would do unspeakably evil things to others. So, and I got to get back to this. I just wanted to introduce it now because what I would like to say the ecological economics paradigm is that people are capable of being altruistic and cooperative. We are inherently probably the most altruistic and cooperative species that ever evolved. We're also capable of evil. There's no question about that. So one other question is the harm we do to nature and future generations evil? We knowingly fly and drive cars and cause climate change. And again, this is just something I'm raising kind of a rhetorical question. But what I would argue is that the definition of a good person is you put the group ahead of the individual. If we consider future generations to be part of our group, then putting ourselves ahead of them is a bit evil. If we consider nature to be part of our group, then putting ourselves, ahead of the interests of nature would also be evil. We'll get back to all this. This is just a prelude. So there's part of this EE paradigm, though, we do believe that humans are good and not these self-interested homogenous globules of desire as modeled by mainstream economists. And so the EE paradigm, we have people have concern for others. We're capable of cooperation. We're capable of altruism. We're prone to satiation. We don't want more and more forever. And although, as I'll get back to it, we are clearly capable of, evil behavior or undesirable behavior as well. But I'll return to that. So the other point I want to make about economics is that economics are evolutionary systems. They continually change. I would say coevolutionary, that, there's gene culture coevolution and coevolution between humans and the environments. We started out as small bands of hunter-gatherers. We kind of knew everybody in our group, very non-hierarchical. Most resources were shared. When we developed agriculture, suddenly private property rights became necessary because if you're growing food, you don't want others to take it. We had denser populations leading to hierarchical, political, economic, social, and religious systems. Much denser populations. When we developed the industrial economy, we had access for the first time to non-renewable resources. We no longer lived just on solar power. We had this insanely valuable source of fossil fuels. As I say, I think we really need a national push your car to work day so that people recognize the value of a fossil fuel. For $1 worth of gas, it would take you 40 hours to do that amount of work. And this allowed us to, mine all sorts of minerals and chop down forests and fish out the oceans with fossil fuels. And then we had the Great Depression, which was an economic event completely unexplainable by the economic theories of the time. And as a result of that, we had to develop new economic theories, new institutions, Social Security, welfare, all of these other things dramatically changing our system. We've developed a monetary economy. And I think one of these things, this evolution from hunter-gatherers, where you cooperated because you knew each other, we developed other ways to cooperate by expanding our system of trust by somebody who's our same tribe or our same nationality or our same language and accent or our same religion. That expanded our ability to trust people. But money allows us to coordinate economic activity with people we neither know nor trust. We trust in money. And I want to talk about this. We've also developed this knowledge economy where knowledge improves through use. The most important input into any new innovation or new idea is old ideas. And human knowledge, I would say, is collective and cumulative. And I'll get back to that. It's a culture. We store knowledge collectively. No human on their own is capable of even surviving. I'll get back to that. But all of these evolutionary systems, all this evolving of our economy has led to these ecological crises, which propose dire threats to the future of human civilization, to the future of many species. And we need, if we continue with current trends, we are going to have catastrophic, undesirable impacts. And we really need to develop an ecological economy. And like in all systems, we must adapt or go extinct. So that's really where we are. That's what we've got to do. Um, and so very quickly, I'm going to talk about the ecological economic goals. And the first thing, as any ecological economist knows, that really the idea is it's ecologically sustainable scale, where scale is the size of the economy relative to the ecosystem that sustains it. And we have reached a point. So the more our economy grows, the more we consume. Our first units of economic activity is food, clothing, shelter, absolutely essential things. But as we get bigger and bigger and bigger, we spend it on more and more meaningless stuff, bigger flat screen TVs, huge gas guzzling cars, things we don't really need or care about. And at the same time, the ecological costs of economic activity are increasing exponentially, threatening to reach a point where there's like a threshold beyond which we have runaway climate change or massive biodiversity loss with unacceptable ecological costs. But at some point, the diminishing marginal benefits of economic growth come to exceed the diminishing marginal benefits are become less than ecological costs, and economic growth makes us worse off, which Herman Daly has called uneconomic growth. And that's where we are now today. What we really need is economic degrowth, where we need a smaller economy, but concentrating on producing the right things for human well-being. And I'll talk a bit more about that. So in addition to ecologically sustainable scale, this is all about caring for future generations. It makes no sense in any ethical system to say we care about the unborn future and don't care about people living in misery today, meaning we really need to care about the welfare of individuals. And one thing is, if we live on a finite planet with finite resources, well, those resources that were created by nature or by society as a whole should not belong to individuals. They should belong to all of us. And right now we have a system in which, somebody makes a minor tweak to existing knowledge to create Facebook, and then they become billionaires, or make it minor tweak to existing technology to create Tesla. They become these billionaires, even though they're capturing for themselves this knowledge created by society, and then they're capturing resources for themselves that were created by nature, the oil, that belongs to oil companies. So really, the idea of a just distribution is grounded. If you work hard for something, perhaps you deserve it. But if you're just taking what was created by others, maybe not so much. And ecological economics also categorically distinguishes between needs and wants and prioritizes needs. Needs are entirely different than wants. They're physiological necessities, not tastes. And finally, ecological economists focus on efficient allocation, which these days, mainstream economics, what they say is an efficient allocation is one that maximizes monetary value. That's nonsense. If I had time, I would give a detailed critique of that. I think ecological economics on a planet of 8 billion people, probably the best we can hope for is secure sufficiency for everybody. You never need to worry about your next meal or shelter or clothing. Those are guaranteed, but we need to do that at the lowest ecological cost. And that really should be what we're striving for. We want to do it efficiently. So this is a super quick introduction to some of ecological economics. And I want to ask people here. So again, you can say in the chat, what ecological or what economic system were you raised in? So just throw in the chat. And I can tell you what people always tell me, but neoliberal capitalism, these are the answers I always get. And I'm asking this typically to my students who are, 18 to 22, patriarchal capitalism, neoliberal capitalism. I would actually argue that we were raised in a wildly different type of economy. We were raised in what I call the core economy, the family. Our parents didn't charge us room and board. Our parents gave us the things, the necessities we needed, free of charge, out of love. It was a gift economy, and it is. And even today, I would say, as a university professor, I make way less as a professor than I could in other fields. My brother is a businessman, probably makes 10 times my salary. My friends who went into Wall Street, their annual bonuses were 5 times my salary. I'm giving this presentation right now free of charge. I'm doing it because there's things I care about. I'm doing it because I feel an ethical obligation to do it. This is part of the core moral economy of family and community. And I still argue it's a very dominant part of our system. We do have this, the market economy, the patriarchal capitalism, neoliberalism, all of that. That's absolutely true. Uh, these economies are based on $1, one vote. It's all based on individual self-interest. You don't do things, you don't gift to others. It's a very different type of economy. We also have the public purpose economy, which really is how we solve public good problems, provide public services, collective action problems, all these things. And, part of it is like national defense, but it's also providing, lighthouses and roads and governance and, legal systems, all of this. These are, the public goods by definition are things the market don't do well. These are incredibly important. And typically, as countries get wealthier, a larger and larger share of their GDP goes towards the public purpose sector, which is not just government, it's also NGOs, et cetera. And what I think is really still, well, we're still raised in it, it's not missing. We're also raised in the ecological economy in the elements of ecosystems combine to create these emergent properties to regulate atmospheric gases and water flows and to provide all the life support functions we need to survive. So we are deeply embedded in this ecological economy. The problem I would argue right now that we face is we lack economic institutions to manage our relationship to the true ecological economy. And that's one thing I want to get at in this talk later on, is the need for that. So, so I think we have a diverse bunch of economic systems. And I also, because this is the modern monetary lab or modern money lab, I do want to talk about money markets in the ecological economy. I love this quote by Herman Daly. He says, anyone who is not confused by money probably hasn't thought about it very much. I added the N finance. But I think this is very true that money. So when I did my PhD, I did 4 years of a PhD in neoclassical economics. I learned 3 words about money. And that was that money facilitates barter. Or I could say 6 words because I learned separate 3 words. Money is neutral. Money has no importance, no role. All the mathematical equations of conventional neoliberal economics work just fine in a barter economy. So this is the story I was told, and it turns out it's errant nonsense. Is so much of what we learn. For one thing, this myth of barter economies, and I'll get back to that. But so we have these theories of money and finance. We say the idea was that money facilitated barter. We used to have to, take a cow to the bar and try to get drinks from that. And, so we invented money to, facilitate those interactions. That's a core, Adam Smith introduced that idea. It's still, I am embarrassed to say, part of the textbook with Herman that I want to get rid of in the next edition, the idea that money facilitates barter. We tell this story that banks are intermediaries between savers and borrowers. People deposit money in banks, which is lend loan to borrowers. Banks get a little interest, savers get a little interest. This is the way it works. I'm going to point out that is also nonsense. That's not the way the system works. That money is neutral. And that's, I believe that who has the ability to create money, it confers enormous power on them. And then we have, the Nobel laureate Eugene Fama talked about the efficient market hypothesis, where stock markets, the price of any asset embeds all the relevant knowledge. So the price is what it should be, essentially. There's no bubbles and busts. So we have these theories. We use these theories to build institutions and rules. And those rules and institutions, so the money system, money is this incredibly powerful tool for coordinating economic activity with people we neither know nor trust. It also has this capacity to earn interest. So it's this very powerful tool, and it evolves within the conditions, the rules and institutions we develop. And so we have this idea, that, well, if money doesn't, if money's neutral, it doesn't matter who creates it. So we literally let banks loan money into existence. This shows the theory behind, the idea that there's a a fractional reserve, which is what the Fed talks about. The Bank of England actually just right out and says banks loan money as much as they want. How much money is created depends on who wants to borrow it. This is bank money, I should say. I'm going to talk about government money as well. And we also have this idea that, we don't need regulations because markets are, efficient and perfect. So we don't regulate. And so we have deregulation leads to these huge problems. But the basic point being that our theories lead us to design institutions which affect the evolution of the system. And I really think that one very, very important thing about money, I believe that humans evolved is small bands of hunter-gatherers. And what our superpower, the human superpower, is our ability to cooperate. There are things we can do collectively we could never do as an individual. And even the most simple hunter-gatherers, we talk about primitive hunter-gatherers. There's evidence that when people lost parts of their population, they lost key valuable technologies. We need to be a group of a certain size to have technologies. An example of Tasmania, when the Europeans discovered Tasmania, the Aborigines there did not have sewing needles or fish hooks, yet they did have relics of those. Apparently, when Tasmania became separated, the population got too small to sustain certain technologies. And I'll get back to that. But the basic idea that we were cooperative groups allows us to solve huge numbers of problems, but to cooperate with somebody, it really means me putting their interests or the group interests ahead of my own. And you only do that if you know they're going to reciprocate in the future. Otherwise, if I come home with an elk and I share it out, I have this surplus of elk, more than I need. It's going to rot if I don't share it. I share it out with people who don't have enough. Immensely valuable to them, negligible value, the excess to me. This year, my elk is 460 pounds of squash I grew in my backyard, which I've given out hundreds of pounds of. And then what happens then is when I share my surplus, people feel this obligation, a social obligation to reciprocate. So every economic interaction is one. Economies were never based on barter. They were based on reciprocity and gifting. Somebody shared what they had. It created a social responsibility and obligation for somebody to do the same in the future and creating stronger and stronger ties. They say the complexity of tracking reciprocity drove the evolution of our brains, made us as intelligent as we are. There's an interesting book that says money is tool, money is drug. And the way I interpret this article anyway, it says that money actually came to precisely measure reciprocity. I come home with this, or, this elk and I share it out. How much do people, what's that mean? How much is going to somebody help me with my garden? How much are they going to help me do something else? It's really hard to track all that. In a monetary economy, I give somebody a piece of the elk. They give me some money. Over and done. No more, no more social ties. Every economic interaction comes to a close. Doesn't develop social relationships. But that also relieves us from the necessity to track all of those social relationships, which is so difficult that we lash onto this thing of money with a vengeance. And I want to talk about this concept of supernormal stimuli. Another Australian example here. So a supernormal stimuli, a lot of species have these little algorithms they develop that allow them to survive in their natural conditions. This is the Australian brown jewel beetle. And it has an algorithm that says, go mate with the largest brown iridescent object you can find, which throughout evolutionary history was the female brown jewel beetle, until Australians started throwing their beer bottles out the window. And the big brown iridescent bottle was way more attractive than the female jewel beetles. And the males would try to frantically copulate with these beer bottles to the point where it threatened the survival of the species. And I think that money is a supernormal stimulus. It's humanity's beer bottle. We go after money with this obsession, even when it threatens our own welfare and well-being. Money also has profound impacts on human behavior. I'm not going to go through all of this. This is just a list of articles that shows that, studying economics makes people more selfish and less cooperative. thinking about money makes people more selfish, less cooperative, just thinking about it. Rich people tend to be less empathic, more selfish, less ethical. And studies showing that monetary payments crowd out cooperative behavior. If you pay somebody to do something they would have done anyway, it often backfires. You get a good friend say, hey, can you help me move? I got to move this weekend. I got the moving van. Can you help me for a few hours? They'll say, sure. At the end of that time, you give them you split a 6-pack of beer and a pizza. They're really happy. You give them $30 and they think, what a cheapskate. I'm worth way more than that. So the point is that money it just changes our relationships to each other, and it creates a new type of economy. So now I'm going to briefly talk about modern monetary theory and ecological economics. So here we're talking about government money spent into existence by the government. And one mild critique, and I think it's being addressed actually, that I have of modern monetary theory is a lot of modern monetary theorists say, as long as we have surplus capacity, then we can spend as much money as we want without causing problems. By surplus capacity, they typically mean labor and capital. And this is true. If there's unemployed people and you employ them, you're not going to drive inflation. Most businesses in the US and around the world actually have massive surplus capacity. So government spending money is not inflationary when you have this surplus capacity. But the fact is that all economic activity requires energy and raw materials. So if the government is not careful on how it spends money, it can spend that money and dig into use more energy and more raw materials, and we have no surplus capacity. We have a massive ecological deficit. So this is a big problem that has to be addressed. Of course, one way to address it, spend money to alleviate ecological constraints, to develop sustainable agriculture, to develop alternative energy. Then we're alleviating one of these constraints, and we're back in the realm of you're fine to spend the money. Ecological economics also concerned about socially just distribution. I love this idea of a job guarantee. You could have a job guarantee at a living wage that would, ideally, if you're hiring people to develop alternative energy and, sustainable agriculture, sustainable activities, you can pay everybody. That obviates the need for a minimum wage, obviates the need for social welfare, except for those who have physical disabilities or something. One other comment I want to make, though, is a lot of modern monetary theorists seem to be very concerned about inflation, and I'm going to talk a little bit later about debt, the private sector debt. So private sector debt in the U.S. is about 80% of GDP. So when we get inflation, the value of and in the United, it's different in different countries. In the United States, most debt is at a fixed interest rate. So if inflation goes up, the real value of our debt goes down. The real value of our payments goes down. And so I think there is this, silver lining to inflation if it's done correctly. And inflation is also a form of a tax. Modern monetary theorists say that you keep spending money into existence as long as you're not driving inflation. If you're driving inflation, you could tax money back to manage the inflation. But inflation is a tax on people who hold money. And of course, who holds most money now in the world, cash money, is mafias around the world who use the $100 bill as their currency. So this would be a major tax on organized crime. Inflation turns out to be a tax on organized crime. So these are a couple of issues to think about. But government money can be directed exactly what you want to achieve. If you want to achieve more sustainability, invest in alternative energy, invest in sustainable agriculture. You want to reduce unemployment, create jobs. So government money can very effective for efficient allocation because we can spend it exactly how we want. Modern monetary theory, excellent ideas. One other thing I think modern monetary systems pay too little attention. Oh, actually, sorry, I was going to say. Other thing about modern monetary theory is it says taxation really is to be used to control inflation, I would argue that taxation is an incredibly valuable tool, and I'm sure modern monetary theorists would entirely agree. And we can, we should use taxation wisely. We should tax rent, unearned income, which I believe you buy stocks, they go up in value, you created nothing yourself, tax that. Tax natural resource extraction, tax waste emission. So the idea, tax what you take, not what you make, unearned income, tax bads, not goods, tax ecological degradation, et cetera. And I think we desperately need to tax wealth, not just income. I also think we should be huge increases in income tax that could asymptotically approach 100%. We talk often about, oh, what's too high a tax? We should actually say, what's an acceptable residual left after a tax? So Elon Musk reportedly made $110 billion in 2021. So if you taxed him at a 99.9% tax rate, he'd only had $100 million take home. Tax him at 99.9%, straight out all his income, he'd still have $10 million. We should start thinking about how much is enough left over rather than how high a tax is too high. So that was just a few points, but now I want to talk. And this just shows actually how important taxing wealth will be. This shows the highest marginal tax rate in black, and this shows the share of wealth controlled by the top 0.1% before taxes. So you actually see that high taxes lead to high taxes lead to a good distribution of income. Low taxes lead to a poor distribution of income. Over here, where this seems to get out of whack, this is just looking at income tax. This is where we reduce the capital gains tax in the US, which is primarily rich people, where we saw wealth skyrocketing upwards. So, taxation is a super valuable tool. Mainstream economists say it creates deadweight loss of economic surplus. I would argue it's a super valuable policy tool. But I want to turn to now one issue I think mainstream monetary theorists neglect a little too much, is horizontal money, money created by banks. And banks, this has been studied in the UK, banks loan like 97% of money into existence. When I go to the bank to take out a mortgage, I am not borrowing $100,000 that somebody else had deposited. The bank is writing me a check for $100,000 that didn't previously exist. How they do this is, now my mortgage, the bank counts as an asset. They have this asset of $100,000 I owe them, and their liability is that $100,000 in the bank, so that they cancel out, books balance. And for me, my asset is the $100,000 in the bank. My liability is the IOU. So a lot of people say, well, these things cancel out, therefore we don't need to pay much attention to them. And actually, most politicians aren't even aware that banks can create money. A survey found that 85% of British politicians were unaware that this was the case, even though the Bank of England says explicitly this is the case. The Fed actually acknowledges this as well. So you have this horizontal money created by banks. And what do people mostly borrow money for now in the US? The theory is that I would borrow money to invest in a business, and that business would increase productive capacity by 5%, maybe 10%. I'd borrow at 5%. So I'd take my profits from increased production to pay off the bank. Society comes out ahead. The bank comes out ahead. Everybody comes out ahead. But in reality, what people primarily invest in now is not new production, but in existing assets. So in the United States, there's like $20 trillion in outstanding mortgages. Margin debt is money borrowed to invest in the stock market. That's now at a record 635 billion. Sorry, not trillion. Sorry. Just a typo there. Firms, rather than firms borrowing money to invest in real physical production, firms are borrowing money to buy back their own shares. In fact, the only time the stock market creates money for new investment is with initial public offerings. Right now, firms are buying back their own shares, typically with borrowed money because it gives you a tax advantage, at 12 times the rate of IPOs. So the stock market's become a drain on real money. And you buy back your own shares, you've essentially, the number of Exxon shares is fixed. So when Exxon buys back some of its shares, you have a fixed supply. That means price is determined by demand. They've raised demand, they raise prices, they manipulate prices. And it creates a positive feedback loop. That if I, if the price of stocks is going up, I want in on that. So I'm going to buy some stocks. That's going to increase demand, which drives up the price faster, which gets more people to buy in on it. And you get this positive feedback loop with prices skyrocketing upwards. So the fact is that most money is borrowed to buy existing assets. So the story that I borrow money to invest in real physical production and then pay back the debt out of that physical production, says the economy is growing. But when I borrow money to buy stocks, I have created nothing new of value. I get richer. Or in my city right now, people are investing like mad in buying houses. So we have 20% of our housing stock is empty, but the price of houses went up by 50% in the past 3 years. So there you can't match that investment. So people are buying more and more and more. As a result, we now have the second biggest homeless population in the US, and the quality of life in our city has plunged because people are buying existing assets, not creating new jobs or new wealth. This is a great case study of this. March 23rd, 2020, the stock market was in free fall. And Jerome Powell said, we're going to do whatever it takes. The Fed is going to make credit available at low interest rates. And if necessary, we will buy assets to make sure prices don't go down. The asset, land is an asset, fixed asset, finite supply. Stocks, typically fixed asset. As soon as we increase the demand and supply is fixed, prices start to go up. And once Jerome Powell said that, it led to the fastest 50-day increase in stock market history in the US. Over 1 year, the value of the stock market doubled. It's now more than twice GDP and the value of the stock market. So when we see that double, the 1% of Americans who own 50% of stocks see a huge increase in their wealth. So this is really problematic, because when you increase the value of assets, you increase the wealth of the owners of those assets. And it's not real wealth. As soon as people tried to sell those assets, like when Elon Musk sold $5 billion worth of Tesla shares, the price falls. If everybody tried to sell their stocks and realize their gains, the price would crash. It's kind of like phantom wealth. But it does cause these massive bubbles and busts. And so, modern monetary theory is very correct in saying that we should not be worrying very much about government debt, except that, when we're selling bonds to the private sector, which is kind of dumb. We could just spend the money into existence. We instead sell it to the private sector. But as you can see here, this is a little bit out of date. I'll show you a more up-to-date one. This just shows divides it up. Government debt is a very small share of the debt pie. Households, here it shows households at about 60% of GDP. Now household debt is about 80% of GDP, and corporations. So most debt is the private sector. And this is debt from banks. So banks loan them money at interest. And this just shows that, there was that temporary dip I show 2008, 2009. And now it's going up and up again. Debt is over 300, total debt is over 360% of GDP. But private sector debt is well over 200% of GDP. So we have, private sector debt, it's over 200% of GDP and growing faster than GDP. Consumers in the US pay 10% of their disposable income in interest. We're essentially tithing to the financial sector. This shows, and anytime we buy anything, the people who made this shirt almost certainly borrowed money from banks for the manufacturing process, where the price of this shirt includes the interest. Everything we buy, we are paying interest to the financial sector. And the financial sector is not actually producing things. It's simply providing money for others to do so, but taking a share of that every time it does. And this shows the GDP share of the US financial industry, which has quadrupled in recent decades. And you see the last time it reached a peak was right before the Great Depression. And now every time we have another recession, we lower interest rates, which strengthens the financial sector again. If you take a look at the data from the previous graph, I just traced over, credit market debt minus government. So this is only private sector debt. And what you see is private sector debt exactly matches or very closely matches the share of wealth captured by the financial sector, meaning our pain is their gain. The more deeply in debt we are, the more resources we are transferring to the financial sector. And so look at bank money in ecological economics. We talk about sustainable scale. Recent headline, building wind power, canceling coal. It's all drowning under borrowing costs. Banks are charging high interest rates for these activities we desperately need. Here's where modern monetary theory, the government could just spend that money or provide that money, create that money for those sectors. Instead, we leave it up to the private sector, which clearly puts profits over the planet. They're loaning tons of money now for the fossil fuel economy. And I won't go into that very much, but and also in terms of just distribution, 10% of disposable income is going to interest. We're transferring more and more of our wealth to the financial sector, which is the most concentrated sector of wealth. These are the richest people on the planet often. So we're just, exacerbating this concentration of wealth. And again, it's profits over people. And in terms of efficient allocation, the market sector, or the market banks, as long as the economy is booming, they will loan money hand over fist. The asset service collateral for the loans. So they will just loan money like mad, driving up the price of these assets until something happens. And, for some reason, either the banks don't make the money available for a new person to buy the asset, or the owners of those assets decide that, maybe it's time to sell, maybe this can't go up forever, and they start to sell. And as soon as they start to sell, the value of the assets plunges. So it's no longer serves as collateral on loans. Banks stop lending money. Less money circulating in the economy leads to, recession and depression. So we have this system of bubbles and busts with bank money, and really detrimental to an ecological economy. So, monetary reform for an ecological economy, one thing is simply do not allow private banks to loan money into existence. After the Great Depression, the University of Chicago conservative economists basically said that the banks being able to loan money into existence are driving, bubbles and busts, and we've got to stop them from doing that. That was the Chicago plan. I'm a big advocate, actually, of public banking, where all banks are owned by the public. Credit is used to promote the common good and not profits. And then you can charge interest. But just when the government loans or spends money into existence and taxes it back to destroy money, banks loan money into existence, repayments destroy it, and interest payments destroy it. So interest payments would be equivalent to taxes. So this is, essentially monetary reform for an ecological economy. And now I probably tried to cram too much in, but I'll try to get this done within the next 10 minutes or so and hopefully leave time for questions. The challenges we face as a society are things like, pollution and climate change and excess resource harvest. And these things are all social dilemmas. And a social dilemma is defined as a situation where members of a group can gain by cooperating, but cooperation is expensive. So each individual is personally better off not cooperating, no matter what others do. And so self-interest, if we're all acting in our own inherent self-interest, regardless of what others are going to do, we're going to keep spewing CO2 into the atmosphere. We're going to keep taking those fish out of the ocean or chopping down trees. And it's in my own self-interest, but for society, it's a death sentence. And this is characteristic of our most serious challenges, even pandemics. The idea that if vaccines are publicly funded and provided at cost or below or even free, then we get herd immunity and prevent viruses from evolving and even infecting those who were previously immune. All of these challenges we face are social dilemmas. And how do you solve a social dilemma? So, these are collective action problems. So self-interest and individual choice, you can't have individual choice over the climate stability or over biodiversity. You can't have private property rights over these things. The private profit motive, when the benefits go to the individual and the costs are collective, capitalism, the market economy, is suicidal. Across disciplines, it's widely recognized the only solution to social dilemmas is cooperation and altruism. And which mainstream economists say is not possible. Evolutionists used to say that. And that's really what I want to look at. I now want to look at this idea of the evolution of cooperation. And there's this multi-level selection theory, which is really emerging. One of its proponents is E.O. Wilson, the leading he's now dead, but one of the most famous biologists in the world. Another proponent is David Sloan Wilson. But multi-level selection theory basically says that altruistic groups outcompete selfish ones. That island with the good people on it outcompetes the island with the bad people on it. And at the same time, however, within the group, the selfish individuals outcompete altruistic individuals. That greedy person will have more offspring. And the point is, though, that evolution can take place at both levels. Evolution requires heritability, variation, and differential survival. And among individuals, that tends to be genetic. But among groups, it tends to be culture. And there's more variation between cultures than of individuals within culture. So we have variation. And cultures clearly are transmitted from one generation to the next. And they have massive impacts on our survival. The cultures that developed cooperation could build the irrigation systems and take down the mammoth or hunt the whale or do those things that required cooperation. So both cooperation and competition are possible. Which approach is most adaptive is determined by the problem we face. We currently face social dilemmas, which require cooperation and altruism to solve. So this brings into this the nation of morals. What bonds us together is a group. It's morals and ethics bond people together into groups. And that ethical value that, putting the group ahead of the individual is a good person. And that's what we reward. And that allows us to cooperate as a group, which purely selfish people could not do. And morals and ethics evolve. As I say, we inherit our morals and ethics from our parents, our peers, our culture. There's huge variation, huge impacts on survival. So morals and ethics, if you don't believe that morals and ethics can evolve, if you don't believe in the evolution is scientific, you're probably a creationist who just believed it was ordained by, ordained from above, which is not particularly scientific in my view. And lots of studies, anthropologists have researched this, that cooperation is the most universal moral value across all cultures studied. The good person puts the group ahead of themselves, and the evil person puts themselves ahead of the group. But this raises the question of what's the individual and what's a group. So this idea of major evolutionary transitions, and the idea is that solitary individuals form into a cooperative group and become so cooperative they can no longer survive and reproduce apart from the group. And this is archaeans and bacteria fuse together to become the eukaryotic cell, where the organelles tend to be bacteria, the cell wall is archaea. The individuals cannot survive without the whole cell. Eukaryotic cells combine to become multicellular organisms. One of our cells can't survive separate from our body. Multicellular organisms combine to become social animals. A human cannot survive apart from society and culture. We would die almost immediately. For me to feed myself breakfast this morning, the technologies required, we needed to know about soils. We needed to know about, metallurgy to make the tools, which mean we needed to know about, we needed to have, wheels and engines. The amount of knowledge for me to make breakfast was created by billions of people over thousands of years, is collectively held. No single mind could contain the knowledge in a lifetime of study to make my breakfast this morning the way it was made. We are unavoidably social. A human cannot survive apart from society any better than a cell can survive apart from a human. And a basic tenet of ecological economics is that no species can survive, or no complex species can survive apart from the ecosystem. All of our species come together to create this complex ecosystem that regulates the gases, the water, everything we need to survive. So we depend entirely upon our ecosystems. And so unfortunately, we have learned not to see the connections. So in the Enlightenment, Rene Descartes famously distinguished between mind and body. And, mind and soul is what makes things valuable. Body is just mechanics, which means that nature and animals, they're just mechanical things, deserve no more moral standing than a machine. Um, and so, that was the Enlightenment. And then market economics actually uses this methodological individualism, saying everything is the individual. There's no such thing as society, essentially. They say we only gain utility from personal consumption. As Milton Friedman said, the social responsibility of business to decrease its profits. Ayn Rand talked about the virtue of greed. Margaret Thatcher, there is no society. All of this is, we view humans as individuals distinct from society. Society is not even necessary, whereas the opposite is totally true. Humans are unavoidably part of society. Individuals are unavoidably part of society. The species is unavoidably part of nature. We've got to get rid of these ontologies of separation. And selfish individuals threaten the welfare of the group. So a selfish cell that focuses only on its own reproduction is a cancer. A selfish individual that puts their needs always above society is a sociopath. A selfish species that only focuses on its own expansion is a plague and threatens the ecosystem. So these are basic uh, elements of evolution. This is how evolution works, that we need to cooperate to survive. And economic systems reflect levels of selection. So the market economy is purely egocentric. It's all about the satisfaction of subjective individual preferences. It's only the individual. And it's explicitly so, a very egocentric economy. And there is a level of selection for this. There's a reason for having, attending to our social need, our individual needs, because we do have individual needs. There are times we are selfish, but that is terribly suited for public purpose economy, which is public goods and public services, which the market simply won't provide. And we have nation states that provide these for the group so that are group centric. We're developing international efforts to create anthropocentric rules that look at us as a species. But if we focus only on our species, we've increased our population fourfold in 100 years. We've increased our consumption ninefold. If we focus solely on our species, we're going to obliterate the ecosystems that sustain us. We need an ecological economy. This has to be the future of ecological economics, is recognizing that the humans are part of the global ecosystem, inseparable from it. We can't survive without it. We need economic systems focused on that whole system. We need ecocentric economic institutions. We talk a lot about ecosystem services, which are defined typically as nature's benefits to people, which is really, anthropocentric. We operationalize it through markets, putting monetary values on it, which is egocentric. This is absurd. We need to redefine ecosystem services as nature's benefits to the biotic community, of which humans are a part. We need to make this the foundation of a new sector of the economy that focuses on the welfare of the whole system that sustains us. This is what I see as the most important thing for the future of ecological economics. We need to develop what we call an ezoic era. So, Thomas Berry famously said that we need to see nature as a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. This is the antithesis of the Enlightenment view, where we see nature is just objects. Once we see it as a communion of subjects, we then have moral standing. These are things that, nature has a moral standing and that needs to be paid attention to. And I think what we really need to do, for the past 50 years, we've been expanding the market economy to take over personal relationships, to put our elderly and old people's homes, we're pawning off everything to the market economy. We've got to flip that around. We've got to really rely on that core economy of reciprocity, gifting, community, and care. Expand that. That is how we need to interact with nature. So we look at these indigenous cultures and we say, oh, so many indigenous cultures saw themselves as part of the ecosystem that sustained them. They had this ontology of integration, of being part of the system, and they saw nature as showering them with gifts for which they had to reciprocate. They had to care for nature. They had to take only what they needed. And why do we see this in indigenous cultures? Is it because because people used to be better? No, I would actually argue that you had, thousands and thousands and thousands of cultures. Those that had this attitude towards nature are those that survived. Those that saw nature as something strictly to use for their own welfare, and they're destroying the system into which they had evolved to survive, and they went extinct. Nature selected for cultures that treated nature with respect and awe and assigned it moral values. And as I said, it's sociopaths put themselves ahead of the society. We don't want to be a sociopathic species. We want to put nature, we need a part of the economy that focuses on that. And then finally, I just want to mention this idea of performativity and reflexivity. So a lot of scientists say the object of science is to study a system and, just explain how it works. That's the role of a scientist, not to change the system. I would argue that all social scientists are objectively trying to change the system. That is my goal. I study the system as it is to figure out how to redesign it as it should be to conform to my moral values, which are the well-being of other humans and life on Earth. And that's what I want to do. And social systems, this is not a futile endeavor. Social systems are changed by the theories about them. I mean, Adam Smith and Karl Marx and John Maynard Keynes and Friedman profoundly changed the systems they studied. Interestingly, we barely have a theory of science that explains how to study systems that change by being studied. My fervent hope is that Daly and the other ecological economists, their theories are able to change the system we study. So I really view ethics and morals as inseparable from social sciences. We can no longer rely on natural selection to weed out those cultures that are destructive. We need to rely on intentional cultural evolution, identify the problems with our current culture. The biggest problem is we see ourselves as individuals and not part of society, and is a unique species, not part of an ecosystem. We need to extend our moral values to the rest of society and to the other ecosystems if we hope to have a future. So sorry I went on for too long. I know that's a risk when you ask me to talk. But I hope there's time for questions and stuff. I haven't put everybody to sleep.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Josh. That was a really, really fascinating talk, and so much going on in the chat as well. I'll just unmute Stephen.
I should have looked at the chat and then I could have toned down my.
There's so much in there.
No, let's not.
Lost your train of thought.
I was just explaining a few banking institutions to some ecological economics students on that. That ignore that for the sake of the questions, though. It's the other questions.
So yeah, so
you're on mute,
I don't know if somebody's going to moderate the questions or however it is. I'm happy to answer any, and I'm also happy with critiques and telling me where I'm wrong. I am a huge believer that science progresses by identifying errors, and there's things I used to say I no longer believe. Things I say now I probably won't believe in the future. So please be critical too.
When the facts change, I change my mind.
Exactly. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think there's still quite a lot of people on the call. I'm seeing over 80 people have stayed with us past the end of the hour. So that's fantastic to have you all still with us. Josh, are you okay to take some questions?
Sure.
Need you leave or do you have time?
Yeah. No, I'm fine. I'll let you moderate it just because that way I don't have
Okay,
to
I'll
read too
do my
much.
best. There's a lot of comments about what we can learn from First Nations cultures, and you did touch on that a little bit. Perhaps would you like to just expand on that in terms of ecological economics?
Yeah. So, my view on this is that, we typically look at modern Western culture as like adaptively superior because we've just like plowed over all the other ones and taken over, and therefore we see ourselves totally superior. A lot of cultural evolutionists see this change. You're gradually progressing towards Western type cultures, which is total nonsense because evolution, you got to pay attention to time. Cultures that persisted for 10,000 years keeping their environments relatively intact versus ours that has posed unprecedented threats to our systems within 200 years. That's a very big issue. And I'm not one of these. I'm not Pollyannish. I don't think that indigenous cultures always lived in harmony with nature. They drove a lot of species extinct. They did things, somebody mentioned they didn't have enough energy to have these big impacts, but a lot of places they did. A lot of cultures drove species extinct, and many over the course of time often drove themselves extinct. So I'm not saying, and I also think a lot of these tribal cultures were for much smaller groups. We're 8 billion people. You can't adapt those cultures. We need to adapt the wisdom from those cultures to our current situation. And I think this basic idea that I see very widely spread across a lot of indigenous cultures is that they recognize that they are part of the ecosystem and they extend moral values and it's part of their moral sphere. And I think that is absolutely critical. And the other thing we always talk about the superiority of Western science. And I think if the goal of science is to explain the Big Bang or to manipulate matter, maybe we've got them beat. But if the goal of science is to, keep surviving for millennia, maybe Western science is a little bit weak.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff in the chat here. There's one comment from Tasha, which I wouldn't mind hearing more about too. And her comment reads, "We need to give everything that has been othered humanhood, like they've begun to do in New Zealand, and start breaking down the hierarchy that makes man at the top of the ladder created by the Great Divide. But how?"
Yeah, right. And so and that is
nature rights argument.
Yep. So this is and here's where I need a little bit more work, but it's very interesting. This multi-level selection theory. Some of the authors have collaborated with Eleanor Ostrom, and they say that her 8 core principles for effective management of the commons, they have generalized to be 8 core principles for successful cooperation, which extends from cooperation from small groups all the way through to the global human enterprise, and theoretically up to the cooperation between humans and the rest of ecosystems. And I need to do much more work on this, but there's this idea that there are these core principles that have underlain the evolution of cooperation across species and can be applied to really help change our morals and ethics. And as I say that moral and ethical values have changed profoundly in recent years. It's not too long ago owning slaves was considered normal, and racism and sexism and all of these things were considered normal. Now they're considered morally aberrant, and those are huge, profound changes to our moral and ethical values. And we just have to, and I don't know the answers, but we do have to figure out how to extend our moral sphere to encompass the rest of life.
Thank you. Yeah, there was a comment from, I think it's either our Stephen Hale or somebody else called Steve, about looking to the future. I've lost the comment in the, oh, there we go. Do we have the chance to turn this around?
Yeah, that was from
that was you. Yes.
Yeah. No, and so I really do believe that humans are an amazingly adaptive species. With essentially Stone Age technologies, we took over every environment on the planet. It was just through culture. And so I think we are amazingly adaptive, and we now have, one of the biggest, one of my biggest beefs is I think we now have an unprecedented capacity to spread ideas at the speed of light, essentially through social media. But social media, we've decided to turn over to the private sector, whose goal for social media is to get people to watch ads. So it's geared towards promoting consumerism. And the way it turns out to get people to stay on board and watch ads is to polarize them and show them really controversial things. So what we really need is an end to polarization and an end to consumerism. And we've taken the most powerful tool we have to achieve those goals and turned it to exactly the opposite uses. And so I'm a huge advocate of, basically I'm a huge advocate of making all knowledge freely shared, especially any knowledge that contributes to a socially just sustainability transition, and especially social media. Could you imagine if the algorithms underlying social media were to get people to see commonalities between each other, to reduce partisanism, to get us to consume less, to get us to care about the planet? That would be so powerful.
Wow, what an amazing idea. Thank you. Speaking of open source, I think if people wanted to look for the textbook that you wrote with Herman Daly, they can find that online.
Yes, you can. Technically, it would be a violation of copyright, but I'd be delighted if you download. I've been trying to make it free for everybody. I think you can even get the most recent edition through LibGen. And also you can write to me. I think, I'm not sure, totally sure, but if you write to me I can't post it, but I think if you ask me for it, I can send it to you.
Okay, brilliant.
I'm not that clear on copyright laws. I'm opposed to that in general.
We can't officially recommend people to do that, but our students are all over the world, and unfortunately, you can't get a legal e-copy of the book. But people do manage to find it because Josh and when he was with us, Herman kindly just left it in the various sites around the internet where you can find the book.
I have a physical copy here. But
Yeah.
And I also would say that Rigo has his Ecological Economics for All site, where he's trying to make a free open access, source. And I just saw an email from Phil Long where he's writing a new textbook. And some people say, is that competition? I say, no way, that's cooperation, man. We need to get these ideas out there. And I'd love to see, more options and more books out there. So
Phil's book should be great because it will bridge ecological economics and MMT and much more. I don't think we're going to see that this year, though. I think it's going to be a while before it takes a while to write these books, doesn't it, Josh?
Thank you for mentioning Ecological Economics for All. I just posted the link for that in the chat. There's so much good stuff on that website. If you're new to all of this, I think there's free courses that you can do. I'm not sure about the time zones for Australia, but there's so much resources that you can grab from that website. It's very very user friendly. So please go and have a look there. And somebody has posted your email address for getting in touch, which I'll post again. Thank you. That's Tasha. So helpful.
And I will warn that I get inundated with emails and I'm terrible at replying. I don't mean to be rude. I do my best. But if I reply to all my emails, it'll be like 4 hours a day. So what I tell people is, if you really want to reply, send it again.
which I'm guilty of.
And just to stop Josh being flooded, if you would like a copy of the brilliant textbook that Herman and Josh wrote, you can just Google it and find it.
Yes, or you can write to us.
If you don't want to bother Josh, if it's just about getting the book and rather than more generally.
I love Rigo's comment there too.
Okay, well, you have been warned.
Yes.
Great.
Thank you so much for that, Josh. That was a fantastic talk. I enjoyed it so much, and it's a great privilege to have you talk to us. Thank you so much for your time.
And sorry I didn't leave more time for questions. It's one of my definite shortcomings is I tend to talk too much and try to cram too many ideas into too short a time.
You've got some very important ideas to share, but thank you very much for doing so.
And
Right.
lots of big fans on this call. Lots of furious agreement in the chat too. So thank you. It's really
Right.
fantastic.
And I'm thrilled to see all this interest in both ecological economics and modern monetary theory. So
yes, us too.
great. Yeah.
And
thank you all for doing this.
I'll just finish before we turn the recording off. I want to read this comment from Rohan. I love the talk. Thank you, Josh. Was punching the air metaphorically with a yes most of the way through.
And can we just say, I would like to pay tribute, he may not be around anymore, to Phil Lawn for, he spent probably 20 years trying to bridge the gap between modern monetary theory and ecological economics, and he deserves a lot of credit for his efforts.
Phil, I think probably introduced me to modern monetary theory. I think one of his articles on ecological economics, and and
he introduced me to ecological economics.
Great, excellent. All right, well, I'll stop the recording there. Thank you very much.
All right, good to sort of meet